Hey everyone, I'm Julie Gunlock, host of the Bespoke Parenting Hour. For those new to the program, this podcast is focused on how parents should custom tailor their parenting style to fit what's best for their families, themselves, and most importantly, their kids. Today, I am joined by my good friend Hadley Heath Manning. Hey Hadley.
Hey, Julie.
Hadley Manning is the Vice President of Policy at the Independent Women's Forum. She's also the mother of 3 kids. And she recently wrote an interesting piece in National Review called Boys Need a Pathway to Manhood. We've actually talked on this program quite a bit about what is called the boy crisis, toxic masculinity, which I think is a terrible way to call masculine men. And we've talked about how so many school programs are tailored for girls, girls in STEM, girls in science, and not so much boys. So this is a really important. I am the mother of 3 boys, so maybe that's why we focus on this so much. I think this is a really important issue, and Hadley's going to talk about her really important piece, her fantastic piece, and also just some other general parenting issues. So Hadley, thanks for coming on.
Yeah, of course. And I don't think I've shared this with you yet, Julie, but I'm expecting a 4th baby. I just found out that it's a boy. So it's a very timely conversation to be talking about my boys and talking about how really these problems don't exist in isolation, right? We know there are problems for girls in our society, right? I dread when my girls are adolescents and they get on social media, I definitely have particular concerns for my daughters, but then I think there's been more and more recognition in recent years. I mean, there's been several books. I mean, I think back to Christina Hoff Sommers writing The War Against Boys, and there have continued to be kind of a drumbeat of researchers and books and information about the so-called boy crisis or the man crisis. And initially I wrote an article for National Review Online about how the boy crisis affects girls, because, we're the Independent Women's Forum and we're interested in women and girls, but the 2 sexes really need each other. I mean, to act like we do life separately, it's just not accurate for most people. People have, women have men in their lives, women have men in their lives, and we're concerned about their well-being. We care about their success. Obviously, a lot of people hope to match up and mate with someone of the opposite sex. And so in order for our society to be strong, for marriages to be strong, for families to be strong, for kids to have the best opportunities and the most flourishing in their lives, we need both men and women to be doing well. So I wrote about how the boy crisis affects girls, and then that turned into a longer piece about solutions in National Review. We can talk about what some of the solutions are, but of course, I came to this topic with a lot of humility. I am a mother, but a pretty young mother. My oldest child is turning 7, so I haven't really navigated a lot of the parenting problems that come with kids yet. I'm pretty good at diapering at this point. But I'm still learning, right? But I talked to a couple experts and I did some research for it, and I think I have some thoughts to share. The bigger picture, of course, which we can also talk about if you want to, is just about how to think about these problems in general, because I think our society has run into some really big foundational questions about sex differences.
Yeah, well,
let's start with.
Yeah, I can tell you've got a lot to say about this subject, and it is critical, but I want to back you up a little bit. And
Okay.
I'm just going to read the beginning of your piece. It says, you say, they say that boys will be boys, but they say it with an eye roll. We don't want boys to be boys when boyhood is associated with bad behavior, immaturity, messiness, and raucousness. Similarly, society's message for what we really want for and from grown men is often unclear, and the connotation of that message often negative. We've got to change this if we want to address the male crisis. And then you say this, and I want you to expand on this. You said men are falling behind women and men of previous generations. So men aren't only falling behind women, but they're falling behind what men achieved previously. And you say in education, in work, and life. Hadley, set the stage for us. What is the state of men's?
Yeah. Well, there are so many indicators that compare or contrast boys and girls, right? We can look at boys and girls in school. And if you look at the top 10% of high school students, 2/3 of those are girls. If you look at the bottom 10%, 2/3 of those are boys. And so there's this difference in how boys and girls are achieving in school. And there's 15% more women graduating from college now than men, and women are now earning more master's degrees, MDs, JDs, pretty much you name it. And there's part of me that says, okay, well, comparing the two genders, there doesn't have to be gender parity in everything. We've always argued at IWF that when it comes to the wage gap, we shouldn't strive for parity. We should strive for fairness, of course, for equal pay for equal work. And we should give boys equal opportunities in school. But if they're not achieving the same as girls, where's the red flag there? And then I started looking at how boys are doing and how men are doing compared to, say their fathers or their grandfathers. And we've got some other symptoms of a problem here. And that's, you can see it in labor force participation. In 1960, 97% of men were participating in the labor force. Today, it's 87%. And most of the men who are not participating in the labor force, Julie, are actually reporting bad health as their reason for not working. About 40% of men, 44% of men who are not working are taking painkillers. And so we've got, men who are not physically healthy, men who are not mentally healthy. Men's real wages have declined 14% since 1979. So we're seeing, not just that men are falling behind women, which some people, maybe some feminists might say, what's wrong with that? But they're actually falling behind where they have been previously, traditionally. And to me, those things are symptoms of a problem that we should all be talking about.
And are we talking about that? That's one thing. I know that at IWF, we are talking about it. I know since this article has come out, people are talking about it. I know that certain outlets, you wrote about it in National Review. National Review's been great about it. I feel like a lot of conservatives are kind of talking about the men's crisis and the state of men in this country. But wider than that, are we seeing it in the mainstream media? Are people taking it seriously? Because, early on you kind of went, well, is this really a problem? And I do think there's sort of a reaction in a lot of circles.
Yeah.
And I want to talk also I want you to address that question, but I also want to talk to you about some of the experts that you talked to for this article. But again, before we get into that, is this a widespread talked about issue, or is it really just kind of narrowly focused in conservative circles?
I hope that the answer to your question is that increasingly so, people are starting to acknowledge the problem outside of just sort of the conservative movement or, I think there's a reluctance on behalf of some people to talk about the issue because they feel like if they focus on problems that affect men and boys, that somehow means that they're dismissing problems faced by women and girls. And what I believe and what so many people believe, I'm sure what everyone at IWF believes, is that it can be both and.
Right.
You can say, yes, women and girls definitely have challenges to overcome, and we want to help them do that to the fullest extent. But then boys and men also clearly are facing problems, and some of those things are related, they're tied, but some of them are different. And it comes down to, again, what I mentioned earlier about sex differences. Before I move on, Julie, I did want to mention that, I think we've all been concerned, I hope, and this is another thing that I hope is not siloed into conservative circles, but I think there's more awareness of like a mental health crisis in this country, and particularly a youth mental health crisis. But this is where we again see pretty stark sex differences. So there's been sharp increases in suicide rates among male adolescents. The CDC reports that a man in the US takes his life every 13.7 seconds. And young men are 4 times more likely to commit suicide than their female counterparts. And, this is very serious. This is very concerning because I know that people, again, I worry about the smartphones with my daughters. I worry about their body image issues, of course. But maybe the untold story sometimes is that the mental health crisis, and particularly when it comes to suicide, men are, unfortunately, there's a gap there, and men are, way, I don't want to use the word ahead, but they're way above and beyond where women are in terms of suicide rates. And that's something that we, whether you think that politically there's a framing problem to this issue, get over that because we should be talking about it. People's lives are on the line.
Yeah, absolutely. To really examine this issue, you talked to two scholars in this area, Richard Reeves, who's the author of the recent book Boys and Men, and Brett Wilcox. He's over at AEI and he's the director of the National Marriage Project at the University of Virginia. You say that both Reeves and Wilcox emphasize that there's not one solution to the male crisis. Reeves argues that the problem facing men and the solutions in education, earnings, relationship, and mental health are interlocking. Wilcox also prescribes various reforms. What did, one thing you talked about is how Reeves sometimes is criticized because he sort of doesn't talk about the strength of marriage as being primary as much as maybe some conservatives do, that, we sort of say, look, you need purpose in your life, get married, have a family, it'll make you work harder. And we know that does. Married men tend to work harder because they've got a family to take care of. But Reeves makes some good points about how conservatives might be dismissing men who have children who aren't necessarily married to the biological, mother in the situation. So kind of break that down for me. Where do these guys come together and where do they separate?
Yeah, I was really encouraged in talking to these two experts to see that there were, I thought, a couple areas of big overlap, foundational areas. So one of them is that they agreed on the multifactorial nature of the problem, that it's not just one problem. There's not just one silver bullet. There's just not just one solution. Dr. Wilcox may emphasize marriage, but he I don't think would say that that's the silver bullet that will solve all of our problems. And then another area of agreement, and I hope I'm not putting words in anybody's mouth, but I think to even talk about this problem, you have to have certain assumptions, right? You have to understand that men and boys are a thing, that's a category, that's definable. And Dr. Reeves, who is more center left, actually shared with me that he spoke at a conference where I guess the audience was more left leaning, and someone from the audience criticized him for being heteronormative in some of his comments. And he said, well, I guess, if that's what I have to take, that kind of name calling is what I have to take in order to draw attention to these issues for boys and men, then I'm going to have to accept that. And so I thought, well, good for him, because I do think that that's a missing piece on the left when it comes to this conversation, is you have to get over the idea that this is heteronormative or dismissive of other problems, dismissive of the LGBT community, dismissive of women and girls, which are obviously big constituent bases for the Democrat Party, but to be able to elevate these issues affecting men and boys, I think is good. That gives me hope. And I think you have to make an assumption before you even start to talk about this, that there's something natural, innate, biological, and real about boyhood, manhood, to talk about. Maybe there's different solutions that would have particular or disproportionate advantages, or solutions that help boys. They could help girls too, but they might help boys more. It assumes that boys and girls are different. And I think that's a big conversation that our country is having right now. And as a parent, I can say for sure, there's been tons of messaging to parents, especially young children, about how you shouldn't buy the fire truck for the boy and get him a baby doll instead, and you shouldn't buy the pink stuff for the girls. And I think, okay, well, there's a real tension there for parents who don't want to be oppressive and put their kids in a box. And I think that actually the outdated restrictive gender stereotypes are at the root of some of the things we see happening with kids identifying as transgender. That's another topic. But we also, I think, want to foster in our kids what they're naturally drawn to, what they naturally find interesting, what they're naturally gifted in. And, on the whole, speaking with a very broad brush, I think any parent who has raised a boy or a girl or both can see that there's something there. There's something there.
Hadley, it's unbelievable, because I think that there is this idea of we can control things in our children. We can give them the appropriate peace-loving games, right? I'll never forget, Hadley, I was at preschool pickup. You know how you all have to sort of wait in line, you're all lined up waiting for your kid to come out of the door. And there was a very, put this nicely, very crunchy mom, right? And I'll never forget, she said, "Oh, well, we don't," this was one of the first days. "Well, our children don't play with guns, don't have play guns," right? And fast forward, and she had this whole thing, like, we just don't, we go in nature, we take walks, right? Blah, blah, blah. And then fast forward several years, and it was my son's, I think it was like his 8th birthday, and we had a party, and they came, and she brought one of those, I don't even know how to describe it, but it's like a GI Joe figure, and then in the same packaging is like every possible gun, and there's like a ammo belt, and it's like a boy Barbie, okay? But all the like dress up stuff is all guns, okay? And I looked at her and I start laughing, and she goes, I tried." And she said the nature walks, pretty soon he was picking up sticks, and those
Right.
were guns. You
Right.
remember the viral story a couple years ago, how a kid nibbled a Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun, and he was
Yeah.
suspended, right? He was
Yeah.
suspended. But there is something really, and again, I think it's so true what you say about if you've raised girls and boys. Moms of different sexes understand it much more than like me, because I'm an all boy girl, or all boy mom. But you must see this, and again, everyone saying like, well, this is just a social construct. You're just introducing pink to your daughter. You're just introducing
Right.
violent toys to your son.
Right.
It just isn't that way. And I think once we take the politics out and sort of those silly ideas, I mean, the reality is biology really comes into this, and you do see a difference between boys and girls, which is something increasingly I think we want to reject, or people want to reject, that there's any differences.
Yeah. Well, I think people have to think about, is that a bad thing? I think people, why do you want to reject that? Why do you want so badly to reject that? And I think part of it comes down to, well, traditionally, those differences were kind of lorded over women as, oh, you're not capable of doing this job or entering this industry, or that's man's work and this is women's sphere. And some of that, obviously outdated, oppressive, not good. But I think one of the questions I tried to ponder in my piece, and one of the quotes from Dr. Reeves, where he says, conservatives want boys to be like their dad, and liberals want boys to be like their sister.
I was just getting to that quote.
So it's like, is there a third way though? Is there a third way to say sex differences are real? Don't have to put people in a box, and we can still celebrate individualism. Obviously, there are going to be boys who are not into guns or sports, or, and there's going to be girls who are. Can we make room for that and celebrate individualism, while also not totally dismissing the idea that there are these inherent biological, innate, sex-based differences between men and women, boys and girls, that in general will have a big effect on how people live, what they're interested in, what they want to do for a living, how they mate, how they form families. I think we can, I hope, forge a third way where we don't use those things to restrict or oppress anybody, but we also don't throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah. You also talk about this third way, and I'm glad you pivoted over to it, because I was just about to ask you about that, and you've already sort of explained it. But this sort of third way solution, and this is very topical for today, is you say that it will require people on the left to face the reality that mothers and fathers do matter. Mothers and fathers aren't interchangeable. Neither are women and men. Tell me a little bit about that passage.
Yeah, well, that's, we didn't really, I never really responded to your question about conservatives being more maybe inclusive of family models, or families where things haven't gone to plan. Like we can, I think we do, as conservatives, do a pretty good job of saying, well, the ideal is a mom and a dad and a whole family unit. And, in an ideal world, no fathers would die, no mothers would die, no one would get divorced, no one would get remarried. There would be no, blended family, because everything would just be perfect. That's obviously not the world we live in. And, but I think having the recognition of what the ideal is, to get back to my third way concept, you can still say, well, that ideal is not something we should be dismissive of. It's not something we should say, well, because sometimes things don't work out, just forget about it. Anything goes. I think there are very smart, single parents and people who are raising children without, a biological mother and father who are married in the same home with a child, who can still say that they understand that having male and female role models in the lives of children is important, right? That having someone to foster like a maternal type bond with a child and a paternal type bond with a child, that these things are very important. And all you have to do, guys, is just follow Dr. Brad Wilcox on Twitter. He's constantly tweeting about things. For example, he tweeted something recently about how mothers and fathers discipline their children differently. And I thought, oh, guilty. Like, I let my husband be the heavy a lot of the time. You know, just wait till your father comes home. But there's something to that, you know, when a child is hurting and needs someone to provide some kind of empathetic care, that mothers are really good at that in general. And dads are pretty good at saying, okay, buck up, you know, and we all need that. We all need that, those two internal voices in our head. I think a lot of us get it from our mother and father, or we get it from male and female, you know, role models, people who affected us when we were young. And we learn how to say to ourselves, you know, I'm going to have a little grace with myself about this, but also buck up, you know.
Yeah.
And we need that. We all need
well,
that.
Well, I also, you know, I would also say, I think also men and women parent girls and boys differently. I am really tough on my kids, on my boys. Like, I was a super nurturer, always, always, always. If they fell, if they hurt, if they were upset about something, I'd really talk to them. But I gave them a timeline, because you're not going to cry for a half an hour, right? And so, like, I'm a little tougher. I suspect I'm tougher. If I had girls, I may have been a bit of more of a softie. There is, but you're right. The point is, this is so complicated, and it does I mean, again, ideal world, moms and dads fill roles. For instance, my husband, I know this probably comes as a shock, I'm not the most sporty person, and my husband is. And so he fills all of that, the baseball, the driving to games, I mean, I go to the games, but you know, the point is that there is, my husband and I work to fill these gaps, whatever they are. And it is beautiful, but again, it's the ideal. And we hope, you know, that people view sort of parenting in this way as certainly flexible. I mean, I that's the thing that bothers me sometimes in these conversations about right and left, is the idea that the right doesn't want any flexibility, or doesn't recognize these differences per family, or, you know, changes that one family might have for another. I think conservatives do recognize that and do understand that, but it's sort of back to this ideal. They hope that people strive for the thing that is best for the kids.
Yeah. And I think I sometimes as a conservative can be guilty of what Dr. Reeves described to me as, you know, the hammer and the nail scenario, where you see problems in society and you think, well, this all comes back to family formation. You know, I have a hammer in my hand and everything is a nail. Well, if they had just had a family that was stronger, whatever, you know. And I think people are starting to realize, you know, you asked earlier, Julie, are people recognizing this problem with men and boys? I'll tell you one area where I think people are, and that sadly has to do with anytime there's a mass shooting. I mean, who is the shooter? 99.99%. It's a young male who, you know,
who hasn't had a father in the house,
had like a fatherlessness issue, what some people might call a broken home, you know. So this is a problem big time for people on the left, because they're really worried, and they, as we should all be concerned about anytime a mass shooting happens. Obviously, that's the problem, something we should address. But there's more to it than the gun. There's more to it than guns. And that pattern and who these shooters are got to be a piece of the puzzle, you know. So there's that.
I want to talk a little bit about men's only spaces. This is something that I thought was so interesting in your piece. And there's been almost a backlash to, we want to include women in everything. We don't want this exclusionary culture anymore. Women deserve to have entry into these places. But now it seems like it's hard to find male only spaces, and men need this. And, you know, actually you mentioned this in your piece, and I wanted to kind of drive down or go down this rabbit hole a little bit on, my dog is going to hit the bells. My dog is going to want to go outside. Hopefully she won't do it too many times. The idea of scouts used to be known as Boy Scouts. Now it's known as just Scouts. And to me, this is this is a really hard thing for me to, I've been very disappointed and I've been very upset that this has occurred. My boys are all scouts, and now it's, my son right now is at a Boy Scout camp, and there are going to be girls there. And I'm not really happy about that. Now they're kept separate. Generally, they don't intermingle with
That's great.
activities. No, it is great, but it
For
bothers
how long?
me. Yeah. And
Yeah.
it bothers me that it's not a camp just filled with boys. And so, and I actually wrote about this. I wrote several op-eds about this, about how I really wish the Girl Scouts had maybe, if there had been, if a bunch of girls didn't want to be a Girl Scout because they're tired of crafts and, they wanted to do more camping, I wish the Girl Scouts had changed, but they
Right.
didn't. And so then,
Right.
of course, the Boy Scout needed members. But anyway, talk to
Yeah.
me a little bit about this issue as it relates
Sure.
to.
Well, just to give you a little bit of my personal background on this topic, I went to college and I really wanted an all-girls dorm because I just felt like I would be more comfortable in that environment, and for a variety of reasons. Not just because I didn't want to walk down the hallway in my towel to go to the common bathroom, because probably at that time, like, I wouldn't have minded doing that, but it really had more to do with the relationships that I hoped I could form with other women in a women-only space. And I can tell you that it really seemed to me like the university that I attended made a real effort to get rid of single sex dorms and really wanted to integrate people. I mean, it's about like the integration. So I ended up joining a sorority so I could live in a sorority house, because that was one of the few like housing options where I could live with like a bunch of college women. I could have gone off campus and gotten an apartment with a few other girls, but I wanted to find like a big group of women that I could bond with and be friends with in college. And so the sorority provided that for me. I never thought I'd be a sorority woman, but then I became one. I'm very pleased because I gained a lot of friendships as a result. And my husband was in a fraternity, and these are probably like, of all the single sex organizations, Greek life maybe has like the worst reputation because people associate it with partying, or they associate it with like bad behaviors. But truth be told, there's actually a lot of great friendships that are formed in those organizations. I could get into like a defense of Greek life in general as like a surface thing, but I just, to focus on the bonds and the behaviors, I think you have to be willfully blind if you don't see how women in a group of women are different from women and men in a co-ed group. And the same, I imagine, goes for men. I'm never party to a completely male only group because I'm a woman. But I can't help but think that not only are those groups important in terms of friendship building, and to share yet another statistic, there's been a 5-fold increase since 1990 in the percentage of men who say they have zero friends. So we have like a friendlessness problem. I think this is for men and women both. We're like increasingly atomized, increasingly without friends and without community. Huge problem with big implications for every facet of life. But men increasingly, because they're getting married less, because they're, there are a variety of reasons, men are like friendless. And this is, if you want to talk about like antisocial behaviors, they're more likely to manifest in people who don't have any friends.
And also, Hadley, I mean, this is why when, whether it's the women increasingly getting into men's spaces or just the lack of male only spaces, I mean, then and the loneliness factor and like no friends. That's why men are drawn to these video games, and that is another isolating factor. Tell me,
go on. I was going to say, there's the friendship piece, but then there's also this like piece of kind of self-discovery, I think, that can happen in those environments, in single sex environments, because women, I think for women, and this is, again, this whole conversation, you have to caveat, because I'm speaking with very general terms, but I do think there's some good research about, say, for example, girl-only schools, that girls are more likely to say they feel more confident speaking up, speaking their mind, and so I think that the same is probably true in male-only environments, that men are just going to be a little more frank, a little more open, a little more honest about who they are. They're going to get feedback on that from a group of other guys, and that is a part of how we develop and grow as people. Societies throughout history have had, some different roles and some different groupings of men and women where they can kind of sharpen these, I think, developmental pieces of who they are. So to move beyond that, I do think these spaces, unfortunately, have been under attack, have been increasingly rare, harder for people to find. And so that has to do with, I think, is at the root of some of these problems.
Um, you sort of conclude here, you say for wonks and policymakers, while there may be some deep left-right disagreements about sex and gender, because you get into that as well, it seems that there are areas of common ground, such as value of vocational education. For wives and parents like me, there are reasons for hope, not least of which is the attention to the issue is getting. Talk to me a little about vocational. I mean, you touched on it at the end there, but this is something that I think is so important because, in addition to men growing into adulthood and not being married, not having kids, not having friends, increasingly online, depressed, committing suicides, doing drugs, going to jail, like this is a trajectory that's very concerning, but there is a demographic out there who can get out of high school, attend a vocational school, and then be off and potentially making good money on a trade. This is something that became very out of fashion during the Arnie Duncan and Obama years of everyone's got to have a computer and everybody's got to have a college degree. That pendulum is swinging back a little bit. I would say a lot due to Mike Rowe. We love Mike Rowe. He was one of our gentlemen of distinction at IWF, came to our gala. We love Mike Rowe, so I think he deserves some of the credit. But talk to me a little bit about how that might be part of this solution.
Sure. And you mentioned video games. I think, men, interestingly enough, Dr. Wilcox brought this up to me. Like, we think of social media as a female problem. And there's a lot of problems for women on social media. I think it hurts our happiness. I think like it's conclusive evidence that the more time we spend on social media, the less happy we are.
I will just interrupt for 1 second and say we always have a late summer vacation. We always go in August. So May, June, July, and then some part of August. I'm like, everybody's going. I am like, I definitely, my happiness quotient is way low right now.
Yeah. Well, and I think
social media.
They may not put two and two together, but the connections that men share online in video game rooms, they might be worth something, but if they are a replacement for real in-life, in-person connection, and gosh, COVID should have taught us all the worst lessons about this, that online connection is no replacement for in-person connection. In fact, to get back to the vocational training piece, the more time young men spend on video games and the more time young women spend on social media, or the more time we all spend doing, kind of online recreational entertainment things while there's a place for that, to a certain degree, it takes away from time that we could be using to better ourselves, to learn new skills, to learn a vocation, to
learn a language,
to spend time with our loved ones in real life, to care for someone, to volunteer, do things that actually add meaning to our lives and make us feel like, wow, I did something meaningful today. And so one of the pieces one of the recommendations in my article is we should all try to limit our screen time, parents, boys, girls, all of us. But as an alternative to screen time, or as a way to improve our educational system in general, there's a lot that we could do to provide more and better avenues for boys within the education system, and whatever the subject matter is, if it's vocational, if it's a traditional, reading, writing, arithmetic class. I think there's pretty broad agreement that more movement is good for boys. Get up out of your seat, do something. People talk about it in terms of recess. Sometimes recess is great, but also incorporating movement inside of the classroom, getting them moving around, helping them, do things with their bodies to help them remember what they're learning. So there's, I think, and to get back to, you mentioned the line where I say I have some reason for hope. One of my reasons for hope is that I do think that there's starting to be more recognition of these things. I think COVID was a huge, huge setback, because obviously it hurt boys and girls, everyone in the education system. Just COVID was a disaster, right? But I think COVID is, our response to COVID and some of the things that we see affecting boys right now are all rooted ultimately in safetyism, right? Like there have been some schools that have banned the game of tag, for example, because someone might tag someone else too hard. I even heard about a school where they limited outside time, they limited recess to like 7 minutes at a time, because that's about how long it takes for conflict to develop on the playground. And I'm like, kids need conflict. Kids need to learn how to work through conflict.
They do.
The safetyism, it's all bad news.
And too often, the instant there's any kind of disagreement between kids, there's some swooping in maneuver of a
Mhm.
teacher and authority. It's so interesting in Loudoun County. You've heard, I'm sure, about Loudoun County. It's sort of, it's been the place where a lot of the sort of pro-parent movement has started, or is ongoing. And in Loudoun County, it was revealed just a couple of months ago that there was a fight club for little kids, and it was hosted by parents. Now, there were probably some ground rules. There were mats put out, probably in someone's garage, and then there was some sort of like a list of kids that were participating, and there were these fights. And everybody in the area was, I can see from your face, appalled, right? Oh my gosh. And then when I would tell people, I'm like, well, actually, the parents knew, because there was this, at first, people thought, oh, well, it's just kids fighting, right? And like, that's weird, right? Which I'm like, I don't know that that's that weird. Then people were like, well, the parents were involved, which, okay, yeah, I'll give you, that's a little odd. But I think to myself, boys can't fight anymore.
Yeah.
Like, boys will, if you, my son, there, there have been a couple incidents of a kid not being nice to him. If he sucker punched him, right? If that kid insulted him over and over and over again, the requirement is my kid should just take it, right? And then maybe have like, this is why this hurts my feelings, right?
Mhm.
Or whatever. If my kid like, took a swing at him, he'd be out of the school. He might be suspended or something. And so, and look, this is not a podcast to say kids should really be taking swings at each other at school. No, but it is an interesting cultural thing where
Mhm.
boys are not allowed to, I mean, you talk to, if I were to talk to my dad, I bet if you talk to your dad, it's like there were scuffles, there were fights,
Yeah.
and then it was
Yeah.
over. There wasn't this prolonged
Yeah.
bullying.
So there's not to like recommend another podcast while I'm on your podcast, Julie, but I did listen to Jordan Peterson
Sure.
had a guy named Race Kelly on his podcast not too long ago. It was actually after my National Review Boys article published. And honestly, if I had heard this podcast before the publication of my article, I would have gone back and asked to add like a whole section about like play, because play is so important to both boys and girls, but particularly physical play where you're taking risks and roughhousing. It's so important to boys. So I encourage everybody to go listen to that podcast if you want to hear like an hour and a half long conversation about play.
Beep, beep, beep.
Boy.
Yeah,
it's interesting because I know these are things that innately to be true. When husband comes home from work, immediately my boy is climbing on him like he's a set of monkey bars. They play physically and it's rough, and my husband likes to throw my kids way up high in the air, and it's thrilling, and it's like
nervous. Yep.
But you learn where the limit is, and if you never play,
Well, but this
learn
is,
where those limits are.
And this is the other thing. It opens up another issue of this free range parenting movement, which that I have been a part of for a long time, and have really devoted. My parenting style is very much free range within, I'm not quite Lenore Skenazy. Okay. I strive to be, but kids, when you let them go a little bit off a path and they might climb over something or try to climb a tree or do something like that, they will learn their limits. They'll fall down, they'll hurt themselves maybe a little bit, and then they'll get back up, and they'll start off again, and this is how kids test themselves and learn their limits and learn what they're comfortable doing, or they practice and they get better at it. So all of these
or they
things
have a healthy outlet for the aggression or desire for risk taking.
Yeah.
That I think is probably just God-given in a higher degree in boys. I think the aggression and the desire to take risks, you can't suppress it. If you try to suppress it at school, it's going to come up at the fight club. If you try to suppress it in play, it's going to come out in video games.
Yep.
If you try to suppress it everywhere, it's going to come out in violence. And
it is.
And that's,
it is. Well,
that's not where we want it to come out.
I think moms of boys have to be brave in a unique way on their own. In addition to a child learning the limits, every time my boys would pick up a stick, because it was a lightsaber, and they were going to go kill a Sith. Okay. And they would attack another little boy, and there'd be kind of at some point, someone would get hit in the head, and so it would be crying. And this feeling of, I don't want that to happen, just don't play that way. Just don't put the stick down. You constantly have to sort of steel yourself against saying that, because they should pick up the stick and have this imagination and imagine themselves in the Star Wars, and doing all this stuff. And so it's very hard. I mean, believe me, mothers of girls have a whole different, that's a whole nother Oprah show. It's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah.
But I do think it is, you have to be brave to
Yeah.
allow your boys to do some of these things, which are not, and especially, and look, I live in a super left-wing area, and it's even harder, I think, in this area because, there's a lot of, like I mentioned, that crunchy mom. Oh, we don't play with guns. There's a lot of that. And so they might come around eventually, but you're sort of met with that, and you want to navigate this. You don't want to be, a pariah or socially an outcast. So it does become really difficult. Hadley, we're coming up here on a kind of a ending, and your piece is so wonderful. Tell people where they can follow you on Twitter, where they can read the article and all that good stuff.
Sure. I have one closing thought, if I might add.
Sure.
I just wanted to say, in what you were saying, Julie, the thing that's sometimes lost in this conversation is that when the little boys are picking up sticks and pretending like they're guns, maybe some people's first thought is, oh my gosh, they're going to pretend to be a shooter, and that's something bad, and I don't want my kid to become a violent, mass shooter. But there are a lot of people who pick up guns for our country for good reasons, in the defense of others, in the defense of our principles, the things that we believe in, and most of them are men. Some of them are women too, and God bless every single one of them. But there is something really beautiful and worth celebrating about when we can direct the inherent strengths of men and women to their highest virtue. That's a really beautiful thing. And so I think, this conversation is not just about like stopping the worst ills that can happen when you do have a boy and man crisis, which I think we do have. But we can also think, Dr. Wilcox told me that pretty much every physical rescue that he had heard of was a man going in, into the fire, going into the dangerous situation and saving somebody. And that's often the case when there's someone pulls a gun. Well, someone else happens. There's a good guy with a gun, and often it's a man. Sometimes it's a woman too. But these are great things. I think that there's a lot to admire about both sexes when they're really at their best. But if you want to read the whole article, it is in the print version of National Review magazine. You can read it online. You can read it on IWF.org.
Who's on the cover of that? Who's on the cover of that?
That's my husband, actually. No, I think it's an AI man. No, I'm sure
that's
a real
awesome.
Artist did this, but it's super dad. It was the Father's Day edition. So
well, congratulations, Hadley. It's a big deal to get in the print edition. So that's wonderful. And Hadley, what is your handle on Twitter? I know you're on Twitter.
Oh, it's Hadley Heath, because maiden names live forever.
Yes,
so,
Hadley Heath.
Hadley Heath, yeah.
Yeah. Well, Hadley, thank you for coming on as the mother of boys. I appreciate you exploring this issue and talking to me today about it. It is so important, and all your work at IWF is important. So hope you'll come back soon.
Sure. Thanks, Julie.
Thanks, Hadley. The Bespoke Parenting Podcast with Julie Gunlock is a production of the Independent Women's Forum. You can send comments and questions to me, julie.gunlock@iwf.org. Please help me by hitting the subscribe button and leaving a comment or review on Apple Podcast, Acast, Google Play, YouTube, or IWF.org. Hang in there, parents, and go Bespoke.